Grant Holloway came home to find his $6 million ranch drowned. The pasture was a lake of mud, the barn stood flooded to its rafters, and the dam his family trusted for 60 years lay torn wide open. The Homeowners Association president Priscilla Vance did not apologize. She called it a drainage measure and handed him a bill. What she never suspected was a hidden camera on the ridge quietly recording every excavator, every lie, every order she gave that night. Grant was not going to sue for damages. He was going to prove she drowned his land on purpose and make her pay a price she never saw coming. The town of Redstone Creek sat tucked against the foothills of Colorado, a place where cattle fences ran for miles, and the nearest traffic light was almost 30 minutes away. Holloway Ridge had belonged to Grant's family for 3 generations, long before anyone imagined rows of vinyl-sided homes rising on the hillside above it. Grant had left engineering behind to take over the ranch after his father's health declined, bringing with him a habit of measuring everything twice and trusting nothing that could not be verified. That habit was about to matter more than he ever expected. Grant had been gone only 2 days, attending an equipment auction in Denver, when the road leading back to Holloway Ridge turned from dry earth into a churning brown river. Water spilled over the fence line, dragging branches, fence posts, and whole slabs of topsoil with it. The eastern pasture had disappeared beneath a sheet of muddy water. The hay barn leaned at a dangerous angle, and machinery sat submerged halfway up its wheels. He called his longtime ranch manager, Wesley Pike, who was already fighting to force open a drainage gate behind the stables against a current too strong to hold back. No one was trapped, but every minute that passed added another layer of loss. Grant knew almost immediately that this was no ordinary storm. Rain had fallen hard, yes, but Holloway Ridge sat behind an earthen levee and a drainage system he had personally redesigned 3 years earlier, a system that had weathered far worse storms without failing. When he reached the northern boundary, he found a private section of the levee torn open by heavy machinery, the soil freshly disturbed tread marks from an excavator still visible in the mud. A man-made channel had been cut straight from the retention pond inside the Silver Pines subdivision, aimed directly at his land, and an HOA warning sign lay discarded near the breach. This was not an accident. It looked like a plan. Wesley walked the length of the breach, with Grant pointing out that the cut in the earth was too clean, too deliberate to have come from erosion or runoff. Whoever operated the machinery had known exactly where the soil was weakest, carving through it with the precision of someone who had studied the land beforehand rather than reacting to a storm in progress. Grant crouched at the edge of the new channel and ran his hand along the cut bank, feeling the sharp, uniform angle beneath his fingers. It was the kind of work that took planning, not panic. A white SUV pulled up outside the gate before Grant had time to process what he was seeing. Priscilla Vance stepped out, flanked by her vice president Corinne Maddox and a private security guard. She offered no apology. Instead, she announced that the Homeowners Association had carried out an emergency drainage project to protect 186 homes inside Silver Pines. When Grant demanded to know who had authorized machinery on his private property, she claimed the board held an underground access right over the entire watershed surrounding the community and warned him not to interfere with what she called community infrastructure. Then came the first real insult. Priscilla handed him a waterproof envelope containing a formal notice, fining him $25,000 for maintaining, in her words, hazardous terrain that endangered the neighborhood. Grant looked at his flooded ranch, and then at the fine in his hand, unable to reconcile the two. Priscilla told him coldly that he was welcome to sue, but by the time the matter was settled, the ranch might not be worth fighting for anymore. It was in that sentence that Grant understood this was not merely a bad decision by an overzealous board. Priscilla had wanted the flood to destroy the value of his land. Grant did not argue further. He simply took out his phone and photographed the license plate on her SUV, the tread marks from the excavator, and the HOA paperwork she had left behind. After she drove away, he called Laurel Mercer, an attorney who specialized in land rights and environmental liability. He told her only one thing: they did not misdirect water by accident. They tried to drown my ranch on purpose. Laurel arrived at Holloway Ridge the next morning and told Grant not to touch the broken levee until experts and state officials had documented the damage in full. Walking the length of the new channel together, they found survey stakes clearly marking the boundary between Silver Pines and the ranch stakes the machinery had ignored by more than 90 meters. This was not a rough estimate or a careless mistake. It was a deliberate crossing deep into private land that had never belonged to any homeowners association. Laurel photographed each stake methodically, noting the coordinates and cross-referencing them against the county's survey records on her tablet. She explained to Grant that in cases like this, the line between negligence and intent often came down to distance and precision, and 90 meters of unauthorized excavation was neither a rounding error nor a rushed emergency response. She told him plainly that whoever approved this work had studied the boundary closely enough to know exactly how far they were crossing it, which meant ignorance was no longer a defense anyone could credibly raise in court. Grant explained the history while they walked. Silver Pines had been built roughly 10 years earlier on higher ground to the west, while Holloway Ridge had stood for nearly 60 years before that community and long before the association ever existed. The ranch was never part of the HOA, had never signed any community covenant, never used the subdivision's internal roads, never paid a homeowner's fee, and had never granted any drainage or access rights to the board. For 2 years, Priscilla had repeatedly offered to buy 120 acres along the northern edge of the property land that sat directly along a planned highway corridor. Grant had refused every single time. Laurel soon received a letter from the HOA's attorney claiming that a 1989 document granted the subdivision use of a so-called natural drainage corridor across Holloway land. In reality, that old document referred only to a small pipeline that had been decommissioned decades earlier. It authorized nothing close to digging a new channel, breaching a levee, draining a retention pond, bringing heavy machinery onto private land, or flooding someone else's property. Laurel suspected the board had twisted the meaning of that document on purpose, knowing full well what it actually said. Grant and Laurel attended an emergency HOA meeting where Priscilla sat at the center of the board announcing that her drainage project had saved hundreds of millions of dollars in community property. She showed photographs of dry streets inside Silver Pines but never once displayed an image of the flooded ranch beside them. When Grant asked to speak, she allotted him exactly 2 minutes. He used them to ask 3 direct questions: who ordered the levee breached, which company carried it out, and whether the board had obtained any environmental permit at all. Priscilla refused to answer directly, calling the records a matter of community safety and therefore confidential. She then told the room that Grant was placing his personal interests above the safety of 186 families, and several hand-picked residents began criticizing him on cue. Corinne even suggested the association might sue Grant to force him to keep his land as a permanent water containment zone for the neighborhood. Grant answered calmly that his ranch was not a free reservoir for someone else's subdivision, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. After the meeting, a resident named Marvin Holt approached Grant quietly. Marvin had once served on the maintenance committee before resigning in frustration, and he told Grant that Priscilla had once said almost casually that if the ranch flooded enough times, its owner would eventually be forced to sell the Priscilla.com northern acreage at a discount. Marvin had no hard evidence yet, but he remembered seeing a contract bearing the name Kessler Earthworks. Laurel pulled the business filings and discovered that Kessler Earthworks belonged to a man named Boyd Kessler, who was not only the HOA's secret contractor but also a business partner in a real estate development company actively pursuing Grant's land. Grant had once worked as a water resource engineer before taking over the ranch, and after a minor landslide the previous year, he had installed a network of motion sensor cameras along the levee and at several geological monitoring points. Some of those cameras stored footage on independent local memory rather than connecting to the ranch network, which meant the HOA had no way of finding or disabling them. Grant and Wesley retrieved the devices near the breach and began reviewing the footage together in the quiet of the ranch office. The recordings told the whole story. At 11:42, the night before the flood, 2 excavators belonging to Kessler Earthworks moved into position while workers dismantled a section of fencing. Corinne Maddox stood at the site giving directions, and someone marked the ground with spray paint to indicate exactly where to dig. By 1:16 in the morning, Priscilla herself arrived in her white SUV. There was no emergency crew present, no police, no environmental officer, nothing resembling a genuine crisis response. This was a planned operation carried out under cover of darkness. A camera positioned near the water level marker picked up audio despite the noise of the machinery, and through it, Grant clearly heard Priscilla instructing Boyd to dig deeper, insisting she wanted the entire flow directed toward Holloway, before daybreak. When Boyd warned that the current could destroy the hay barn and the stables, Priscilla answered without hesitation that the more damage there was, the sooner he would sell. It was the first piece of hard evidence proving intent to destroy, not merely negligence. Laurel moved quickly to preserve the recordings, creating multiple backup copies, sending the originals to a digital forensics firm, documenting a formal chain of custody, notifying the HOA in writing that they were forbidden from destroying any related records, and preparing an injunction. She warned Grant not to release the footage publicly. If Priscilla remained unaware that it existed, she would keep lying, and every lie would become another piece of evidence against her. That same afternoon, Priscilla sent a fresh notice demanding that Grant not rebuild the levee, not block the drainage channel, grant the association access to his ranch for 30 days, and pay the $25,000 fine within 72 hours, threatening to place a lien on his property if he refused. Laurel knew the HOA had no legal authority to place a lien on land outside its jurisdiction, But the threat revealed something important. Priscilla was trying to frighten his bank and his insurance company into pressuring him before the truth could surface. An insurance adjuster estimated the direct losses had already exceeded $1.8 million, counting a destroyed irrigation system, 2 structurally compromised barns severely eroded, topland a well at risk of contamination, hundreds of tons of lost topsoil, and a full suspension of ranch operations. If the flooding happened again, the $6 million valuation of Holloway Ridge could fall by nearly half. When Laurel received an email from the HOA's attorney, insisting no board member had been present during the construction work, she simply played the video again. Priscilla stood clearly beside the excavator in the footage, undeniable and unmistakable. Laurel said quietly that the HOA had just put a lie in writing, and from that moment forward the case was no longer only about property damage. Laurel brought in Everett Boone, a hydrologist, with more than 3 decades of experience in dam and watershed disputes, to survey the depth of the new channel, its angle, the direction of the current, the volume held in the HOA's retention pond, the erosion patterns, the rainfall data, and the topography before and after the incident. His conclusion was chilling. The rainstorm had merely provided cover. Without the artificial channel and the breached levee, Holloway Ridge would have seen only a few centimeters of localized flooding. Instead, the man-made channel had funneled water from nearly 140 acres into a single weak point on Grant's property, engineered with a slope precise enough to accelerate the current. Whoever built it, Everett said, understood exactly where the water would go and exactly what it would destroy. When Everett inspected the outflow gate at the Silver Pines Pond, he found the locking mechanism had been physically removed, and the gate had been opened fully before the rainfall even reached its peak, releasing millions of gallons of water at once. The HOA claimed the gate had opened automatically under pressure, but the engineering records showed it could only be operated by hand. Traffic cameras near the subdivision entrance caught Corinne's car parked beside the pond at 10:58 that same night. Laurel forwarded a preliminary report to the State Environmental Agency, and an investigator named Nolan Briggs arrived to examine the site. He found the HOA held no permit to dig a channel, no permit to alter a natural watercourse, no environmental impact assessment, no notification to downstream landowners, and no sediment control plan of any kind, along with no legal right whatsoever to enter Grant's property. Nolan issued an order halting all HOA activity in the area immediately. Rather than retreat, Priscilla invited local media to the pond and stood before the cameras describing her actions as a difficult decision made to protect the community. She suggested Grant had neglected his own levee and was now trying to blame the homeowners association simply to collect an insurance payout, even implying that Holloway Ridge had always been a natural floodplain. When a reporter asked Grant how he wanted to respond, Laurel advised him to say only one thing. The engineering evidence and the court record would answer for him. His composure stood in sharp contrast to Priscilla's aggression, and it did not go unnoticed. Meanwhile, the association's treasurer, Darlene Fitch, quietly called Priscilla to voice her concern that the payment to Kessler Earthworks had never gone through proper board approval. Priscilla instructed her to alter the meeting minutes to make it appear the project had been approved 3 months earlier. Darlene refused to sign a backdated document, and Priscilla warned her that she alone would bear full financial responsibility if the lawsuit failed. Laurel filed a comprehensive civil complaint covering trespass, property destruction, severe nuisance, gross negligence, deliberate diversion of water, document fraud, environmental violations, conspiracy to depreciate real estate value, and the matter, punitive damages, along with a request to freeze the HOA's funds before Priscilla could move any money. The court granted an emergency hearing. Priscilla smiled when she received the summons, confident the association's insurance would cover everything, unaware that Laurel had already found a clause excluding coverage entirely for intentional sabotage and board fraud. If the video held up, Priscilla and her allies could be held personally liable. Priscilla called a closed-door meeting and pushed her allies to agree on a single story: that Grant's levee had already been weak, that the channel was dug only after the flooding began, that the project was a genuine emergency response, that no one intended any harm, and that Boyd alone had decided how deep to dig. Corinne agreed without hesitation. Darlene hesitated. Priscilla then directed the HOA secretary to recreate the minutes from a meeting 3 months earlier, fabricating a discussion about hazards posed by Holloway Ridge and a unanimous vote to build emergency drainage. But the digital calendar told a different story. That meeting had lasted only 17 minutes and concerned nothing more than repainting the community clubhouse. Laurel issued subpoenas for meeting recordings, board emails, contractor invoices, text messages between Priscilla and Boyd, metadata on the edited documents, and the HOA's full bank statements. The statements revealed the association had paid Boyd $310,000 under the label of emergency landscaping. 2 days later, his company transferred $75,000 to a consulting firm owned by Corinne. Another $40,000 moved into an advocacy fund controlled by Priscilla herself. This was no longer a drainage dispute. It looked like organized skimming with personal benefit built into every layer of the plan. Laurel found a memorandum between Boyd and a development group called Summit Crest outlining plans for a resort, a small golf course, a commercial strip along the highway, and a set of luxury estates, all of it contingent on acquiring Grant's 120 acres. The memo stated plainly that applying environmental pressure and reducing insurability would improve their negotiating position. Priscilla had used the homeowners association as a tool to drive down the value of Grant's land for someone else's profit. Laurel traced the memorandum back through a chain of shell entities registered under Boyd's name and 2 silent partners, one of whom turned out to be a cousin of Priscilla's late husband. The paper trail showed meetings dating back nearly 18 months long before the first drop of rain ever threatened Holloway Ridge, with notes discussing zoning variances, projected resort revenue, and a timeline that assumed Grant's land would change hands within the year. It became clear that the flood had not been an isolated act of spite, but the final step in a plan that had been quietly assembled for a very long time. Priscilla visited the ranch alone that evening without the board or her attorney, and offered to cancel the $25,000 fine, pay $500,000 for the damaged purchase, the 120 acres for $1.4 million, and keep the entire matter quiet. Grant knew the land's true value once the highway corridor was complete could easily exceed $9 million. When he asked her directly whether this offer amounted to an admission that the HOA caused the flood, she quickly claimed it was simply a gesture of goodwill. She reminded him that the association had reserve funds attorneys and 186 households behind it, and warned that he could never outlast her financially. Grant told her plainly that she was spending the trust of people who believed in her to cover up the fact that she had hired an excavator to destroy his land. Priscilla warned that continuing the fight would make the entire community despise him. Grant answered that he had not cost anyone a cent. She had done that the moment she hired the machinery. Before leaving, Priscilla insisted no one on the board would ever betray her. The very next morning, Laurel received a call from Darlene, who said she had the original meeting minutes, the real emails, and a recording of the closed-door session. She asked for only one thing, that her statement be documented before Priscilla discovered she had reached out. Darlene met with Laurel and Grant at Nolan Briggs's office, bringing a hard drive, a folder of paper records, and an old phone used strictly for HOA business. She admitted she had approved certain payments without fully understanding their purpose, and that once she realized the project could flood the ranch, she had asked Priscilla to stop. Priscilla had dismissed the warning entirely. In the recording, Priscilla laid out a 3-stage plan: divert water into Holloway Ridge during the heaviest part of the storm, use the resulting damage to declare the ranch a dangerous floodplain, and pressure Grant into selling to Boyd's development partners. When Corinne asked what would happen if someone discovered the plan, Priscilla answered that they would simply call it an emergency decision, confident no judge would punish a homeowners association for protecting its residents. Darlene also produced a secret benefit agreement, showing that Priscilla stood to receive 3% of the profits from the Summit Crest project, if the land purchase went through, signed, under the title of Community Development Advisor. That signature became the clearest proof yet of a personal financial motive hiding behind claims of public safety. Laurel made no promise that Darlene would avoid all responsibility since she had authorized payments and stayed silent for too long. But early cooperation, honest testimony, and the surrender of key documents could help distinguish her from the architects of the scheme. Darlene agreed to give a sworn statement. Unable to reach, Priscilla ordered the office locks changed and had her system access revoked, then sent an email to every resident accusing Darlene of embezzlement and claiming she had fled town. In truth, Darlene had never left, and she had already handed her financial records over to investigators. The false accusation only weakened Priscilla's position further. Armed with the new evidence, Nolan coordinated with the state financial regulator, and investigators seized office computers, the Kessler Earthworks contract financial files, Priscilla's work phone, and the real estate development documents. The court froze the HOA's reserve funds, banned the board from signing new contracts, prohibited any deletion of records, barred Priscilla from contacting witnesses, and suspended all construction activity near Holloway Ridge. Residents of Silver Pines slowly realized their dues had been funneled toward hiring a contractor to sabotage another property, paying attorneys to defend the board, financing a private real estate venture, and disguising the money trail. Behind it all, a chaotic meeting erupted with residents demanding Priscilla's resignation, but she insisted she was the only person capable of protecting the community and claimed replacing the board mid-lawsuit would be financial suicide. Corinne reached out privately to Laurel, insisting every decision had come from Priscilla alone, and offered to testify in exchange for Grant dropping his personal claims against her. Laurel refused any informal deal and demanded she surrender her phone in full. Corinne stopped cooperating immediately afterward. A forensic review of Priscilla's phone uncovered a message sent to Boyd on the night of the flood: "Don't stop when the water crosses the fence line. Only stop once the east barn is underwater." The east barn happened to be the most expensive structure on the entire property. Grant realized then that Priscilla had not simply wanted to lower the land's value. She had chosen with precision exactly which asset to destroy in order to cripple his ability to operate at all. The courtroom filled with Silver Pines residents, reporters, and representatives from the environmental agency as the trial opened. Judge Rosalind Keene announced the proceedings would address civil liability, property damage violations of the evidence preservation, order a request to dissolve the board, and penalties under state environmental law all at once. The HOA's attorney blamed an unprecedented storm, insisting the crew had only dug a temporary ditch to keep water from reaching the subdivision, and tried to paint Grant as a wealthy landowner, exploiting a natural disaster at the Pluckin, expense of 186 families. Laurel remained unmoved by the attack and began instead with the rainfall data. Everett Boone presented a three-dimensional flow model, showing that water would naturally have drained toward public land to the south, that the HOA's channel had redirected the current by nearly 70 degrees, that the pond gate had been opened manually, that the levee had been breached at its single weakest point, and that the resulting flow had been aimed directly at the east barn. He compared two scenarios without the HOA's interference. Damages would have stayed under $40,000, with the artificial channel losses climbed into the millions. When Laurel played the recording of Priscilla standing beside the excavator, the courtroom went silent as her own voice confirmed that more damage meant a faster sale. The HOA's attorney challenged the video's authenticity, but a forensic examiner confirmed it had not been altered in any way. Still confident she could control the narrative, Priscilla took the stand and claimed her words had been taken out of context, insisting the damage she referenced belonged to the association if Grant refused to sell drainage rights. Asked why she had denied being present at the scene in an official email, she said she had simply forgotten amid the chaos of that night. Asked about the signed agreement granting her 3% of development profits, she called it an unrelated consulting fee that had nothing to do with the association. Laurel then walked through the evidence one piece at a time. The text ordering the east barn flooded the original minutes with no mention of any drainage project. The fabricated minutes created after the flood, the payments to Boyd, the money that landed in Priscilla's own fund, the development blueprint drawn across Grant's land, and the emails discussing how to lower his insurability. Every document contradicted the testimony that came before it. When Judge Keene asked Priscilla directly whether she had ordered the minutes altered, she answered no. Laurel immediately produced an email in Priscilla's own words, instructing the secretary to fix the minutes to show the project had been approved back in March. The judge warned her that false testimony could be referred to the prosecutor's office. As Priscilla stepped down from the stand, she looked at Grant with unmistakable resentment, still believing the association's insurance would ultimately cover everything. But a representative from the insurance company rose to announce that coverage was being denied entirely since the acts in question had been intentional, driven by personal financial gain, and concealed through fabricated records. The board now faced direct personal liability with nothing left to shield them. Experts laid out the full scope of the damage in detail: $1.9 million to repair the barns, stables, and equipment, $1.35 million to restore topsoil internal roads and the irrigation system, $780,000 to treat well contamination and pond sediment, $620,000 in lost ranch revenue, $450,000 to rebuild the levee and water control system, $300,000 in engineering, forensic, and emergency response costs, and $600,000 representing the temporary loss in property value. The direct economic damage alone exceeded $6 million. Nolan Briggs demonstrated that the water released from the HOA's pond carried leaked fuel from a maintenance yard, chemical fertilizer, runoff construction, sediment, herbicide, residue, and drainage debris, all discharged onto private land, without any permit whatsoever. State law allowed for significantly higher penalties whenever a violation was intentional and the responsible party had actively tried to conceal it. He walked the court through soil samples taken at 3 separate points along the new channel, each one showing contamination levels far above what would occur naturally, and explained that his agency's own testing confirmed the pollutants matched materials stored at the Silver Pines maintenance yard rather than anything native to the ranch. He noted that the association had never filed the mandatory reports required whenever construction activity risked releasing pollutants into a shared watershed, a step that would have alerted regulators long before the flood ever happened. In his professional opinion, the absence of that paperwork was not an oversight but a choice made to avoid scrutiny. Laurel argued that ordinary compensation could never be enough in this case, since Priscilla had not acted in panic. She had staged the excavators before the storm arrived, negotiated a personal financial stake with a developer chosen precisely, which structure to destroy falsified official records, lied under oath, spread false accusations against a witness, who tried to warn her and diverted community funds toward her own benefit. Grant's team asked for punitive damages substantial enough to discourage any other homeowners association from attempting something similar. In her closing remarks, Priscilla insisted the board had acted on behalf of the entire community, trying to spread the blame across all 186 households. Darlene testified under oath that residents had never been informed or given any vote on the project, and that most only learned of the plan after the ranch was already underwater. Grant made clear that he had no interest in punishing the very neighbors who had been kept in the dark. He asked the court instead to protect the funds essential to the community, recover assets from those who personally profited, reclaim money from Boyd, and the development company preserve the retention pond under proper oversight, establish an independent body to manage it going forward. He told the courtroom plainly that he had not come there to destroy a neighborhood, only because its board had tried to destroy his ranch. The words shifted how many residents in the room saw him for the first time. Laurel proposed a total obligation of $13 million covering direct compensation, long-term restoration, costs, environmental penalties, punitive damages, legal and forensic fees, misappropriated HOA funds, and proceeds recovered from the illegal real estate arrangement. Judge Keene recessed to consider the ruling, and before leaving the bench, she ordered court staff to collect every access card, financial ledger, and the official seal belonging to the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. Priscilla shot to her feet in protest, but the judge said only that the board would conduct no further business until she returned. 2 days later, the courtroom filled again as Judge Keene delivered her ruling. She stated clearly that the association's conduct was not an emergency response or an act of negligence, but an organized plan involving trespass, an abuse of fiduciary power, financial fraud, environmental destruction, and a scheme to intentionally lower the value of someone else's property for private gain. The court ordered a total financial obligation of $13 million, broken down as $5.4 million, for compensation and restoration of Holloway Ridge, $2.6 million in punitive damages, $1.7 million in environmental penalties and cleanup costs, $1.1 million in legal and expert fees, $900,000 to be returned to the HOA's own funds, $750,000 for document fraud and violation of the evidence order, and $550,000 to establish a long-term water system oversight fund. The judge made clear that innocent residents would not bear the full weight of the ruling alone. Recovery would come from Priscilla's personal assets, Corinne's consulting company Kessler Earthworks, Boyd Kessler himself, Summit Crest Development, and the misdirected HOA funds, while the money necessary for basic services like roads and clean water within Silver Pines remained protected. The judge then dissolved the entire sitting board effective immediately. Priscilla, Corinne, and the other implicated members lost access to every HOA account, were barred from signing any contract, were stripped of authority over community governance, were ordered to surrender all records and equipment, and were prohibited from contacting any nearby witness. An independent court-appointed trustee would run Silver Pines until residents could hold a properly supervised election. Judge Keene raised the secret profit agreement bearing Priscilla's signature and explained that it proved she had never acted in the community's interest, only her own. Under the association's own ethics clause, any board member who secretly profited from a transaction involving community property automatically forfeited their position. Legally, Priscilla had ceased to be a valid chairperson the moment she signed that agreement, which meant every order she issued afterward could be invalidated. Priscilla rose and insisted the court had no right to seize a community she had built with her own hands. When she refused to sit down, court officers moved toward her, and she was forced to remove her chairperson's badge and surrender the keys to the HOA office right in front of the very residents who once believed she could never be replaced. The judge forwarded the case materials concerning perjury, forged records, embezzlement, commercial bribery, property destruction, and obstruction of justice to the district attorney and state financial investigators. The civil case had ended, but the criminal exposure for Priscilla and her allies was only beginning. Grant did not celebrate inside the courtroom. He simply gripped the hands of Laurel and Wesley in quiet relief. When a reporter asked how it felt to see the board dissolved, he answered only that he wanted his ranch back, and that losing their power had been the direct consequence of the choices they made. Outside the courthouse, Darlene apologized to Grant for staying silent for so long. He did not offer complete forgiveness, but acknowledged that her testimony had helped stop Priscilla from manipulating any more residents. Across the steps, investigators asked Priscilla to surrender her passport while her attorney tried in vain to keep the cameras away. For the first time, she had no board, no funds, and no title left to hide behind. The first payments from the escrow account allowed restoration work to begin at Holloway Ridge. Grant did not simply rebuild what had been lost. He redesigned the entire system. A new levee rose, reinforced with stone, and a watertight core. Water-level sensors were linked directly to state monitoring. Outflow gates received tamper-proof locking mechanisms. Fresh topsoil restored the pastures. The contaminated well was cleaned and certified. The east barn was rebuilt on higher ground, and the creek banks were replanted to prevent future erosion. The court-appointed trustee released full financial records to Silver Pines, and residents discovered that Priscilla had raised dues for years while quietly neglecting the very drainage system she claimed to protect. Line by line, the trustee walked residents through years of budgets that had quietly diverted maintenance funds toward legal retainers and unexplained consulting fees, money that should have gone toward the very infrastructure Priscilla claimed to be protecting when she ordered the ranch flooded. Several longtime residents admitted they had trusted her leadership for so long that they never thought to ask where the money actually went. The trustee promised a full independent audit, stretching back 5 years, along with quarterly public reports going forward, so that no single person could ever again control the association's finances without oversight. A new election followed, requiring every candidate to disclose potential conflicts of interest, forbidding secret contracts, guaranteeing residents access to meeting minutes, mandating independent audits, and requiring approval before any project could affect land beyond the community's boundary. Darlene chose not to run for any position, agreeing, instead, to repay misused funds and continue cooperating with investigators. Grant agreed to join a new regional watershed committee alongside representatives from the ranch Silver Pines and the state environmental agency. He never surrendered control of his land to the association, but he helped design a legitimate drainage route directed toward proper public retention areas, keeping it well away from any private property. Silver Pines alone would bear the cost of building and maintaining it. It proved once and for all that Grant had never opposed community safety, only the idea that safety could be used as an excuse to trespass and destroy. Priscilla lost the home she had put up as collateral for her secret arrangement with the developers, and her related investment accounts were frozen. Corinne eventually agreed to a late cooperation deal but remained barred from holding any governance position for years to come. Boyd lost his contractor's license after state regulators determined he had knowingly carried out unpermitted construction, and Summit Crest scrapped its resort project entirely, forced to sell off assets to satisfy the judgment. Months later, Wesley stood beside Grant on the hillside, overlooking pastures that had turned green again. He asked whether Grant had ever considered selling the ranch after the flood. Grant admitted that on the first night, with water still rising and everything seeming beyond saving, the thought had crossed his mind. But it was Priscilla's own words that changed everything for him. She had believed that enough destruction would eventually force him to surrender, and staying became the only way to prove she had been wrong. Grant rebuilt the wooden sign at the entrance to his property, and this time it carried no challenge and no reference to Priscilla at all. It read simply, "Holloway Ridge, private land protected by law." Across the valley, the Silver Pines HOA office reopened under an entirely new board, its once darkened windows replaced with clear glass, and the minutes from its very first meeting were made public for every resident to read. Grant received the final written confirmation from the court stating that his ownership of the ranch remained fully intact, that the HOA held no easement over his land, that every fine ever issued against him had been voided, that the board was permanently dissolved, and that the restoration work would continue under ongoing supervision. He folded the letter, placed it in a desk drawer, and walked back outside. The creek ran clear again, and the pastures once buried under mud were coming back to life. The sound of repair crews faded slowly into the natural quiet the ranch had always known. Priscilla had once believed the power of a homeowners association could turn someone else's land into a tool for her own profit. In the end, it was her own signature, her own orders, and the very water she had chosen to redirect that swept her power away completely. Long after the cameras had gone and the reporters had moved on to other stories, Grant would still walk the length of the rebuilt levee at dusk, checking the sensors out of habit more than necessity. He never spoke of Priscilla with anger anymore, only with the quiet certainty of a man who had watched someone underestimate exactly how much proof the truth could produce when given enough time. The ranch stood exactly where it always had its boundaries, unchanged its ownership, never in question, standing as a plain reminder that no title, no board, and no signature could ever outweigh the law itself. The HOA had drowned Grant's ranch in a single night, but it took $13 million for them to learn they could never drown the truth.